Why is venture capital indispensable for U.S. national security? Why is it essential for investors, government, and industry to join forces to innovate critical technologies faster, better, and bigger? I'm your host, Navin Girishankar, and today I'm speaking with Mike Brown, partner at Shield Capital and former director of the Defense Innovation Unit at the Department of Defense. Mike Brown, so delighted to have you. I have been admiring your work across industry, government, and now in the investment community. You have been a leader on national security investing, and really happy to have you here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, Navin, you're way too kind. It's great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this topic, which I'm passionate about.
Excellent. Well, let's get started with the big picture. I was reading your testimony to the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition with the CCP, and you argued there, and I quote, "We must prepare the American people for a multi-generational competition with China." And you locate this competition fundamentally around our ability to innovate and innovate technologies faster, better, and at scale. And that in turn is really about the quality of our innovation ecosystem here in the United States. So bring us into that. What is the most important thing we need to know about the quality and the health of our technology innovation system here?
I think technology is ground zero for the competition between the US and China. And you can see that reflected in the value of tech stocks in the marketplace, the amount of interest that gets generated when DeepSeek is released, et cetera. This is going to be the fundamental determinant of both economic prosperity and national security. By that, I mean technology and innovation. If we think about where the U.S. innovation system is, it's basically the same system that we've had since the end of World War II, that Vannevar Bush developed under President Truman, which is the origin of the National Science Foundation. I think this has served us well, but it served us well in a time when America was preeminent in science and technology, when we didn't really have competitors who could match our scale. Yeah, we had the Soviet Union, but they were never a match for the US from an economic standpoint in terms of using technology beyond the military to create a successful economy. Now we have a competitor who's clearly doing that and is, at a much bigger scale relative to the US than where the Soviets were. So I think what we need to think about to improve our system is not a complete overhaul, but we're not spending enough. So we're not fueling that system with what's made it go since World War II. If we go back to the 1960s as an example, we were spending 2% of GDP on basic research as a government. And now that number is down to 0.6%. Half of which is now spent on health initiatives after the pandemic. I'm sure we'd all agree that's a good thing. Yeah. But that means the basic research for national security purposes is now down to 0.3%. That's not the profile of a country that really wants to secure its future and make sure that we're preeminent in science and technology for the next few decades, as we have been in the past few decades. So number one, we need to spend more. And then I'd say, the other area we need to pay attention to relative to China is commercialization of that technology. As the National Defense Strategy has talked about since the time of the first Trump administration, the advantage goes to the competitor who adopts technology and is able to use it. So it's not just the discovery of something, which is now technologies easily diffused around the globe. Meaning you don't have an advantage by inventing something and hanging on to it for a decade or more. It's going to diffuse around the world. You've got to adopt that technology and spread it through the economy, and that's what leads to the economic prosperity part of what we want for our future.
Yeah, this is a great picture that you've provided, like a great perspective on how things have evolved through time. And, I think many people probably now a cliche about the valley of death You talk about commercialization. Tell us a little bit more about this, especially for folks who are not that close to it. Why is that transition from R&D to R&D commercialization so important, and why has there been a gap in the United States?
Well, the gap exists because there can be a delay between when something is discovered or invented and when it's ready for commercialization. And in the case of the government, which has been the largest source historically, if I look over the last 50 or 60 years, of the basic research, and still is spending more for basic research than the private sector, but now the private sector is spending more in R&D than the government is. So that means the private sector is relying on the government for R&D. Technology sometimes will need the funding to be able to be more widely adopted. In the government's case, that is waiting for congressional appropriation and government contract. And that is a valley of death if the government wants to commercialize something for use in defense, as an example. Our budget cycle is 3 years. So if we take more and more of the technology that is being developed in the private sector versus the government, which is a change from 60 years ago, now we're more dependent on the government budget cycle to fund R&D in small companies, and cash flow is the lifeblood of small companies. So that's the valley of death. We've got a technology that we want to deploy, but we're waiting for government contracts to show up.
I want to come back to this topic. It's something that you have been talking about for quite some time, and it's really critical if we're going to win the tech race, or at least stay ahead of it. Before I do that, let me pull up a chart that you've used in one of your recent papers on venture capital, and it really shows how China is leading on a number of technologies and catching up on some other ones where we're in the lead. And you could see that here on the screen. You just look at this list of technologies that China's ahead, and some like artificial intelligence where we're ahead, but I don't think we can rest on our laurels.
Yeah.
Right, not by much. And you mentioned DeepSeek. Now, I show this because you say technology, but it also matters which technologies. And one of the things you've done is you've advocated for an advanced industry strategy for the United States centered around critical and emerging technologies. So which ones are we talking about here, and how would you help us think about prioritizing the ones that matter most for this advanced industry strategy?
Well, fortunately, we have a couple of different sources where the government has already spent time saying what are the critical technologies. So the Office of Science and Technology Policy has traditionally offered a list. The CTO of the Pentagon has also offered a list. And if we compare these lists, they're not very different. And I don't think it would take us too long to think through what are the ones that we think will be most critical for the future. So semiconductors would clearly be there, because chips and AI, which are powered by these chips, are really fundamental to any of these advanced technologies. Then you could add fusion to that, so a source of unbelievable energy. Quantum, understanding the quantum effects and how that applies to computing, communications, and sensing. Synthetic biology, which is that it's very beginning, but could have a huge impact on society. And then space. Those are the ones I would say are absolutely fundamental. What I'm arguing for those that are more hardware intensive, semiconductors, fusion, synthetic biology, those need a little more help than some of those that are software intensive, because also on the list would be cybersecurity and AI.
Yeah.
Those, fortunately, because they're software, do not need help from the government to advance. We have plenty of private capital and plenty of interested sources of that capital, venture capital, where I'm sitting today, which are happy to produce more software-oriented technologies. It's the hardware, more capital-intensive technologies where the risk is a bit higher, where venture capital is not flowing in as rapidly or as freely. Yeah. That's where I think government has a role to play. And it's really evidence of, in our system, the money, the sources of these technology development is flowing to where the profitability is highest, not to where the national capability need is highest.
Yeah.
I think this is the difference between our system and China's. China is much less focused on efficiency of capital, which
Yeah.
we call return on investment.
Yeah.
They want to get a capability for the nation, and are less concerned about what the financial metrics are associated with that.
Yeah.
We're obsessed in our economy because it's market-based with this return on investment, which will have us develop a dating app maybe ahead of Fusion because it's more profitable. It's easier to develop.
Yeah. And given your work in industry before, in your previous incarnation, you have been close to this, both in the cyberspace, in the digital space in general. But let me break down a couple of things here which you've raised, which I think are really important points. Number one, which sets of technologies? There is broad consensus across government, across political spectrum, across economists, across investors, across technologists on the technologies that are going to have an outsized impact on the future of long-term productivity growth, on our economy. Certainly, AI is in the news and the AI stack, but there are other ones as well. The way I think about it is that we're in the midst of not one Sputnik moment, but maybe 5 at the same time, and we know what those are.
Right.
And so what's really important here is that there is a rationale for focus, which you have provided in some of your writings and in your talks. The second thing you've said, which is really important, I want to double click on that, and you've mentioned it, but just like elaborate a little bit more, which is that VC in the US has historically focused on software where you have a shorter term horizon to harvest returns relative to the capital intensive hardware focused ventures that you're talking about. Tell us a little bit about the history of this, just as a background for what you've already told us.
Yeah, well, the irony is that the semiconductor industry, which is so critical to the future of all these technologies that we've talked about, the advanced industries of the future, all based on semiconductors. That was obviously a capital-intensive technology and one developed by the Defense Department. Mm-hmm. The Defense Department and the space program in the 60s really needed this technology. The space program, obviously, for use in Apollo. At one point, the Apollo program was using 2/3 of the output of the semiconductor industry. So kind of amazing that government was a first customer of this leading technology. And then the Defense Department needed it to miniaturize electronics for nuclear weapons. So in that time, the government was an early adopter and not a direct funder in terms of providing equity funding, but through its purchases of big quantities of the industry output was really funding the development of this industry, which then later went on to achieve, cost reduction, scale effects, which now have it, in every product we can think of, we find semiconductors. So if we think about how that's evolved since, as venture capital evolved, it was looking for, okay, what is the highest return for that money? And it became clear that as the software industry developed, and this certainly exploded since the internet, it's much easier to make a higher return with software. Why is that? Well, it's digital. My inputs there really are people writing code as opposed to I need to buy raw materials. So I don't have inventory I need to worry about. I don't have capital equipment to scale a factory. And if I am able to achieve what's called a platform, which you think about that Google has done in search or Meta has done with social media, those create outsized returns based on network effects. Mm-hmm. So more valuable the more people who are using it. So in that world, I have much faster time to revenue and profitability with software. It's much lower cost, it's lower risk, and with the platform, I could generate outsized returns. Mm-hmm. So that combination makes software incredibly powerful and attractive for venture capitalists, and it's why estimates are that 90% of the venture today is going into life sciences, biotech, and information communications technology.
Yeah.
So that's wonderful because the U.S. has a comparative advantage globally. No one is better than the U.S. in software. But it means that we're not as balanced when we think about the other technologies that we'd like to also be leading with.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is, let's just take AI, for example. You could say that when it comes to frontier models and the business around that, perhaps that would be, that's something that will easily attract capital. But if you look at the AI stack, as Vice President Vance recently spoke about when he was in Paris, there's chips, there's data centers, there's chips, there's energy. There are different components to this, especially the chips piece is this hardware-intensive, capital-intensive set of ventures that you're talking about. And so if we have a challenge there with financing, we really can't win the AI race for any sustained period of time, especially when our competitors have the capital that they can crowd into hardware-intensive ventures, and we don't, or at least we're challenged in that regard. Is that fair?
That's very fair. And it's not just AI, you're going to need chips for any of these technologies, the space technology, synthetic bio, quantum. Okay, I'm going to need some different chips there, but the semiconductor technology is fundamental to all of these future technologies, cyber, et cetera.
Let's go back to the point you made around the health of the U.S. innovation system, right? So you've talked about these technologies. You've mentioned this case that you've made quite convincingly about where the focus should be. I'm going to pull up this next chart, which is really the point you made about R&D. If I look at this chart around R&D spend, starting from the 50s till today, it's the point you've made, which is federal R&D is actually diminished relative to its historical levels, at high levels in the 60s. Some of this has been made up, obviously, by business R&D or private sector R&D. There are a couple of points when I look at this chart. One is, I think you're saying that the aggregate level of R&D needs to be much higher overall, given the nature of technology innovation across the different technologies we're talking about. And the second thing is that there's probably a question of the type of R&D that's underneath each of these categories. So if I think of user-inspired versus curiosity-inspired R&D, it's probably different in the federal R&D component here versus the business. But tell me a little bit more about this and whether I have this right.
Oh, Navin, I think you're spot on. So the first point is, right, we should be spending more on basic research, which is really what the government has done, which has declined in the 60s from the, 2% level, which you see in kind of the early to mid 1960s, to now 0.6%, where half of that is being spent on health. So think about it from national security. I went from 2% to 0.03%. Then you're right. We have had a completely laissez-faire approach, or let the market decide what technologies we should be investing in. And we had such a lead relative to the rest of the world that has served us well. The lead is much narrower with China, so we probably could apply more thought to what do we want that basic research, the government spending to be on. So not only should we be spending more, but let's give a little more thought to what are the critical technologies that we want to advance. This will be important when we talk about commercialization, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in a minute.
Yeah.
So how much we're spending and what we're spending money on, and then the business, business spending in R&D, which has helped make up for this gap, is more focused on commercialization or applied R&D versus basic R&D. That's a good thing, but again, we're letting profit drive where that money is spent versus thinking through, if I'm really trying to ensure widespread adoption of a technology, which will benefit the entire country versus maybe select areas, there could be some more thought spent to how are we going to ensure that technology is widely adopted, maybe by industries that could be lagging, which would improve the overall economy, our total productivity. And productivity is the key to having a economy that is going to be setting the pace for the next few decades. That really is going to be a key. Any economist will tell you a key determinant of the health of your economy and the prosperity of your people.
And just tell us a little bit about where the footprint is of federal R&D. There's some in the DOE, there's some in the DOD. Can you give us the numbers or like the breakdown on where it is, the center of gravity on that?
Yeah, we're spending a few $100 billion on a basic R&D, but a lot of that is the biggest proportion is the Defense Department, probably followed by DOE. And I think that this is being determined by what we believe would be the highest priorities at the Defense Department versus where does the economy do we see the biggest improvements? For example, fusion. The Defense Department is not spending any money, as far as I know, on fusion development. So I think that if we thought about what are the critical technologies we would like to ensure come to market and maybe ahead of China, and then how could we be more effectively deploying that R&D spending? There's some ideas in the paper you're referring to that talk about an improvement in outcomes-based research, for example, that will help us make sure that we're driving to some key metrics in our research that would allow us to go a little bit faster if we do that, get to outcomes. And then part of the paper is talking about how could we make that attractive to venture so that we can amplify the amount we're spending in government. And that basically means we need to think about how venture firms do their investing, which is about team, how big is the market, and how mature is the technology. And if we had that in mind as a government, then we'd allow both private equity and venture capital to amplify this R&D investment that we're making and ensure it's more widely developed, more widely adopted. That's the part I think we are completely missing. Because we've been on top for so long in terms of innovation, technology development relative to other countries, we haven't really thought about how do we make the basic R&D more attractive for the private sector to develop. And a lot of things have developed organically without having that thought. Well, we're in much more serious competition now with China specifically. And so we need to be thinking, how do we leverage the venture capital, which is the title of this podcast. Well, the way to do that is make that easier for private sector money to come in and see an opportunity as attractive to develop. And that has to do, as I mentioned, for the venture community, thinking about the team, the tech, and how visible is a large market.
Yes. Now tell us more about that, because this is I think that one of the essence of the point that you're making is we're in a large, boisterous democracy and market economy, and we are trying to focus attention around national goals, and you have to do that differently here than you would in an authoritarian kind of setup like the PRC. Tell us your thoughts on and your recommendations on how to use public capital to provide an incentive for the capital markets, for venture capital, to look towards those hardware and capital-intensive industries that you've been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we think about the total R&D for the U.S. that the government is spending, you have, say $200 billion or so. And then the venture capital industry, as a relative in size, is spending $300 billion a year, so more than that, 3 times, in fact, what the Defense Department would spend on R&D. If you add private equity to that, you add a couple $1 trillion that could be spent per year. So a lot more capital available in the private markets. So we should be leveraging that. So as I mentioned, the private markets are not just going to look at the technology license, which has been available from national labs as an example, and say that's worth very much, which is why we don't get very much pull from private markets by offering technology licenses. If the government were to say, here's a team that's interested in developing this technology, that would be a very big factor for the venture community, having that team. Understanding where the tech is, and if it's developed to the point where there's execution required but not invention, is another big attractor for the venture capital market. It might be a bit of a misnomer. People might think venture capital is attracted to risk. It's quite the opposite. Venture capital is trying to mitigate risk. So the less risky technology a venture capitalist can look at, the happier he or she is. So maturity of the technology is another key component. And the third is how visible is the market. For a lot of the technologies that are important for national security, the government is going to be a big customer. Our budgeting system does not work well to think about multi-year appropriations and big programs. Think about the difference between how we might buy weapon systems today, which is year by year. There's no multi-year appropriation compared to what we did with the Apollo program back in the 1960s. We knew the national goal was to get to the moon, and it was pretty certain that the government was going to spend towards those goals. We had some ups and downs during that period from when President Kennedy announced it until we landed on the moon. So it wasn't smooth up and to the right, but there was a consistent level of funding and funding to reach that goal. My point being, if you were a company that was a supplier to the Apollo program, as the semiconductor firms were, you knew that was pretty consistent, and that allowed you to expand your productive capacity, invest in some inventory, the capital equipment, what you'd need to surge capability. That's what's missing today, for example, in our defense industrial base. There's no certainty. There's no view to what's the higher level of spending that might be coming. And those are the economic incentives that make our capitalistic system go. And the more we lean into those, the more we have an advantage relative to China.
You make a really strong point when you share your public capital framework. We're going to pull this up now, where how do we think about the use of public capital in these different ways? Now, you emphasize this part here just now on the role of contracts. I think you said contracts in your paper. And this provides the revenue predictability for companies to be able to make those investments, a very, very strong incentive. And I'm assuming from what you said, significant room for reform in the U.S. government, including the DoD, in terms of how acquisitions are done in a way that prioritizes these hardware-intensive technologies that will shape the future. But let me ask you, there's another piece to it, which is, doesn't government also, when it comes to government equity or government guaranteed loans, doesn't it also need to be able to take bets, and that the public should be well educated and well versed in the nature of how venture works, meaning there will be failures. And there will also be successes. Could you share a little bit about your thoughts on that? Because my sense is that in the political environment that we oftentimes find ourselves, it's sometimes hard to translate that point. But help me out with that.
Yeah, well, I think the framework really is saying government has a unique role where it's the riskiest bets. There is definitely scope for the government to make investments. And the riskiest bets, the government needs to develop the technology to the point where its private capital can take it from that point forward. Again, execution versus invention. But for a large majority of technologies that aren't as expensive to develop, that really just need market visibility, and in many cases, the government can be a very large customer. I'll give you an example. The Defense Department is the largest consumer of energy in the world. And if you think about it, that makes sense. How many people and equipment we have around the world that needs to move, airplanes, ships, etc. So therefore, the Defense Department could be a huge catalyst for new energy technologies. Yeah. So yes, we could be conserving energy, and there's a lot of activity at DoD to do that. But for developing alternative sources of energy, whether you believe in climate change or not, and I do, it's very important from a resilience standpoint to not be depending on fossil fuels and the huge supply chain problems that creates. So if in fact, DoD were spending there. Think about the Apollo program and putting men on the moon the way we were spending to create basically the beginning of what now is a space economy that we have with all the satellite and sensor capability, if we were spending, the government could actually create that market. The same thing is true with the air taxi market, which has military applications. There are quite a few examples of that. The space is another example of that. We're not forward-leaning in terms of we're envisioning a space economy the same way we developed the interstate highway system in the 1950s, which had untold economic benefits. We could be doing the same thing in space today. So that's creating a lot of market visibility, which will attract a ton of private capital. So it's really looking for where could the government be a large customer and shape an industry of the future. That's where contracts are the most important ingredient.
Understood.
Because that is, again, the primary tools we have in a capitalistic system. If the technology is riskier, then a government grant can be appropriate. That's where we are with fusion, as an example. The government could help develop that to the point where the technology is more mature, less risky, less invention required. So that's not ready for contracts yet. Right. And in between is the technology may be proven, but we need to scale up a plant. So that's where a loan might be the appropriate tool. So most important is contracts. Right. We could be doing a lot more there with visibility for companies to multi-year spending. We're terrible at that in the government. Again, only very few items have multi-year appropriation. And then really design the right financial tool to support the technology depending on where the risk is. Riskiest would be equity. In between would be the loans, and then where the technology is ready to just be commercialized. But we need people to invest in the productive capacity. That's where the contracts come into play.
The framework is simple, accessible, and powerful for how we can prioritize the uses of public capital. This administration and even the previous administration were talking about a American sovereign wealth fund idea. And that could mean many things to many people. But I'm curious about your thoughts about that idea. I would also add that, Senator Coons and a few others have, including potentially, I think at the time, Senator Vance had been working on the idea of a industrial finance corporation, something similar to an instrument that would close the valley of death. What are your thoughts on this, including the relevance of a sovereign wealth fund?
So first of all, in closing the valley of death, I think we already described that really is a matter of reforming the budgeting process. Why does it take 3 years to develop a defense budget and start spending from it? So we don't need a sovereign wealth fund to solve that problem. And sovereign wealth fund would be pretty low on my list of ideas for the simple reason that the financial markets in the US are the deepest and biggest in the world. So capital isn't the issue, it's incentives. So I think as it relates to incentives, we already talked a bit about how the government could be more effective in thinking through what am I going to do to incentivize the riskiest technology. I may need to look at where do I need to demonstrate technology maturity versus where do I need to incentivize expansion and productive capacity, like in the defense industrial base. Yeah. So I would rather see that government investment back into R&D, as we talked about earlier in this podcast. Yeah. That's where the real need is, to make sure we're preeminent in science and technology. And then do we have the right incentives in place so that when we have a breakthrough, a discovery, can we commercialize that and ensure that's adopted more widely throughout the economy? So I'd rather see that same money spent there. And we talked about earlier, what are the incentives that would attract private capital? If we work on the incentives piece with plenty of capital ready to put to work in the U.S. I think that the most important, highest goal for us is to make sure we're leading in science and technology. I don't hear that as a national goal, but it would certainly be on the top of my list. It's what's ensured our prosperity. It's what's made the venture capital industry, which doesn't do the invention. It just is in the commercialization business. That will ensure we have prosperity for the next couple of decades. We're seeing the prosperity we enjoy today because of the investments we made decades before.
Yeah. It's a strong point. I want to just pick up a thread on private capital because that point really strongly resonates with me. And one of the things I've been seeing among folks in the private sector is the evolution of indices that prioritize national security or patriotic investing, right? So just to take the analogy with ESG, there was a long period where the idea was let's attract those investors that have not only financial goals but non-financial goals related to environment, social, and governance investing. Is there an analogy today for national security investing, patriotic capital, competitiveness investing, all the things we've been talking about, critical and emerging technology investing, where we could say we have a set of investors that clearly have financial goals, but they also are interested in our national security? And you'll see a number of indices out there, ETFs, that are being done in this way. These are obviously in the public market, so not the illiquid markets like venture or private equity. But I wanted to get your perspective. You've seen this for so many years. I wanted to get your perspective on how relevant are these things? How promising is that as an approach? And is that something you would encourage?
I think it's a good approach because you're creating some visibility for the needs that we have, certainly from the national security standpoint. But I would rather see our energy focused on creating longer term incentives.
Yeah.
I think one of the issues we have with our capitalistic system is it's very short term focused. The economic theory that we're operating under, which led to globalization and Milton Friedman's school of thought, the shareholder revolution, really comes from an understanding of operating in the world without competitors. So free market system, everyone believes in what we believe in. Global trade is good. And those things are true in an environment where I don't have an adversary who might be coercive and withhold inputs from me.
Yeah.
So we don't have an economic theory that really accounts for that, which has led to some of the situation we're in today.
Right.
Our profit-seeking behavior has led to supply chain problems because our economic theory says everyone's our friend and no one would ever think about being coercive in operating their economy. Well, the Chinese have shown us there's a different way, and it's not consistent with that type of thinking. So I think one of the most productive things we could do with our market-based system is think about how to take those very short-term incentives. If you think about the capital markets rewarding companies for every last penny per share per quarter, and I know this firsthand from being a CEO, if there were more incentive to invest more for the longer term, invest in R&D, there's no incentive for companies to invest in long-term R&D because the markets will crucify them for that and expect, why are you not taking that spending and giving me more cash flow near term? That's how our defense companies are rewarded today. Cash flow near term, which investors expect to be plowed back into share buybacks.
Yeah.
That's not investing in the long-term productive capacity of the company. So I would love to see some emphasis on, our capital gain system now. 1 year qualifies you as long-term capital gains. I don't know who thinks 1 year is a long-term investment horizon. Probably no one. So let's think about, we could have a graduated system that rewards people for investing in 5-year, 10-year projects.
Yeah.
That's where we need to rethink our system because China has a very long-term perspective on investment. They're thinking about where's their economy going to be in 2049, 100 years after the PRC, had effective control of the country. And so they have investment priorities that are 10, 20, 30 years in length. What have we had in the U.S. that has anything close to that since the first space program? Yeah. So we need to be thinking longer term. We need to be encouraging our companies to think longer terms and making investments in our future.
Excellent point. And I want to pick up a thread there around how global markets used to operate. and then the recognition that we have a major competitor in the value chains, in the global markets that operates according to mercantilist and sometimes malign objectives or pursues them. And so the notion that we could simply operate in a globalized economy and just compete as firms in the marketplace is something that we can't accept as a given anymore. But there's
Right.
also a tendency to overcorrect, which is
Yes.
that folks, I think, are veering towards what some would say is protectionism, a fear of navigating the global markets. You, in your paper, make an argument that I think is really quite interesting, and I think people should pay attention to it, which is the notion that we do need to trade. Technology value chains are global in nature. So let's develop a global trading bloc or a trading bloc with allies or those that are aligned with us, market economies, as a way to really respond to what is an effective mercantilist threat. Tell us a little bit more about your idea here, because I think it deserves a lot more attention. It's a really important one.
Well, thanks, Navin. Yeah, I believe strongly that free trade is part of how we will compete and, frankly, prevail in a global competition. Just because we have one large player in China who has a very different perspective, a mercantilistic viewpoint, which is trade means we win, you lose, and is coercive, meaning withholding, raw inputs for others. Rare earths would be an example of that. Cutting off, supplies of many things that they might see other economies needing if it serves their political interests. So just because we have that player doesn't mean that we can't get the benefits of a free and open trading economy with our friends and allies. So yeah, rather than retreat and be focused on just what we can do within our own borders, I think we can have a much bigger impact by collaborating with our allies and partners around the world. The GDP of U.S. allies and partners, of course, the asymmetric strength that we have is we have allies and partners relative to China, which only has Russia, Iran, and North Korea. I'd much rather be in our club than theirs. Is that the productive output, the GDP of those combined countries is 3 to 4x what China's is. So that's a way to make sure that we have a very productive economy. And you could isolate or contain China. You could influence their bad behavior by not providing them access to that much larger market. That requires a little more coordination with allies and partners. It requires strengthening that relationship. Maybe there's opportunity to do combined R&D, as an example, as we're starting to do with the AUKUS partners, that you could envision that being even broader. But from a trade perspective, rather than thinking about imposing tariffs on our allies and partners, we should be thinking about how to increase the economic integration across those economies and using that as a strength relative to countries that's behaving, poorly and in an adversarial way, which China's doing.
This is a great insight, and I think hopefully bringing the technology competition perspective to questions around trade policy, I hope will allow us to prioritize where do we use tariffs, where does it make sense, where does it not make sense. I think we're obviously in the early days right now of a new tariff agenda with the Trump 2.0 agenda, and I think it's worth having that criteria of does it help us innovate faster, better, and bigger, which is what we started out with. When you look at tariffs, when you look at strategic capital, when you look at any number of these policies. You have really helped us.
We have to get away from the trade deficit being the single measure of success.
Yeah.
You can imagine the trade deficit non-existing, and we have imbalanced trade with China, but we're supplying timber, coal, other raw materials, and they're sending to us electronics, manufactured goods of high value. The trade deficit could be zero, but that's a horrible situation for the U.S. to find itself in. Equivalent to that joke from the I think it was a Bush administration, potato chips, computer chips, what's the difference? There's a hell of a difference in
There's a
terms
big
of
difference.
where your economy is headed and what your capacity is.
Yeah.
And the person that said that now disowns the comment because they realize in hindsight it wasn't smart. But we need to be thinking about how do we use trade to improve our technology position relative to China and our economic prosperity relative to China. And our trading partners can have a big role in doing that. If we seal ourselves off, we're not going to be achieving that. We have tremendous strengths within our country, but you're not going to benefit from all the brain power, ideas, capital, and prosperity we get from trading with allies and partners.
Mike, you've helped us really think through very, very complex issues, but also very urgent and pressing ones. Really, I want to end the way I started. Your work has been a source of great inspiration for me and for many others, and thank you for continuing to keep us focused. And we hope that you'll come back and join us as you do more writing and more thinking on these topics. But really, I really appreciate your time today.
Well, love to come back, and thank you so much for the opportunity, Navin.
Thank you for joining this illuminating conversation with Mike Brown. You can find this episode of Betting on America and more on CSIS.org, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is Navin Girishankar reminding you that everyone has a role to play in winning the tech race.